Today's reading comes from Mark's Gospel. It's from chapter 7. In chapter 6, we've heard the amazing miracles of Jesus feeding the 5,000 men and all the other people who were there, of walking on the water and then crossing back to the other side of the lake, where it says people brought to him sick people lying on their mats. Everywhere Jesus went, to villages, towns or farms, people would take those who were ill to the marketplaces and beg him to at least let him touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were made well. So it's an incredible high, and we see what God is doing in Jesus. But of course, the gospel writer's intention here is to not only show us how wonderfully well received Jesus was by the crowd, but how the complete opposite was true of the religious authorities of the day. And that's what starts to happen in this reading. So Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, 14 to 15, and 21 to 23. Some Pharisees and teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered round Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples were eating their food with hands that were ritually unclean. That is, they had not washed them in the way the Pharisees said people should. For the Pharisees, as well as the rest of the Jews, follow the teaching they received from their ancestors. They do not eat unless they wash their hands in the proper way, nor do they eat anything that comes from the market unless it is washed first. And they follow many other rules which they have received, such as the proper way to wash cups, pots, copper bowls, and bits. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why is it that your disciples do not follow the teaching handed down by our ancestors, but instead eat with ritually unclean hands?" Jesus answered them, "How right Isaiah was when he prophesied about you. You are hypocrites, just as he wrote. These people, says God, honor me with their words, but their heart is really far away from me. It is no use for them to worship me, because they teach man-made rules as though they were God's laws. You put aside God's command and obey the teachings of men." Then Jesus called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing that goes into a person from the outside which can make him ritually unclean. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that makes him unclean. For from the inside, from a person's heart, come the evil ideas which lead him to do immoral things, to rob, kill, commit adultery, be greedy, and do all sorts of evil things. Deceit, indecency, jealousy, slander, pride, and folly. All these evil things come from inside a person and make him unclean." So, we have an example here where the religious authorities, and these again aren't just anybody, these are, it says, some Pharisees and teachers of the law from Jerusalem. So these are the big guns. They've come to and they gather around Jesus in a threatening way, and they notice that the disciples aren't following some of the traditions. Now, the teaching from the ancestors, or teaching from our elders, was the oral tradition which the Pharisees and the scribes had created to help people interpret the commands and the teachings of the first 5 books of our Old Testament, the books of the Torah for the Jewish people. So, quite understandably, when people have some broad brush rules and regulations, there will always be questions. What happens in this instance? How should I behave in this instance? If this has happened, what do I do? And this oral tradition, which Jesus is referring to here, was developed over a period of time and passed down from generation to generation. So people were told how to do certain things. And those rules and regulations had extended into all areas of life, really, including how to wash your hands before you eat. Because in the Old Testament books, there is teaching about washing of hands before eating, but that applies only to the priests. And the oral tradition had developed that to suggest that it should also be followed by all people. So the Pharisees and the scribes come to Jesus and they say, well, look, in our tradition, as followed by everybody here, this is what we should do, and your disciples aren't doing it. Now, it's rather strange that the disciples aren't doing it at all, but it's a springboard to a bigger conversation. So they're not following this oral tradition, but Jesus is saying, well, now look, come on. You're basically picking me up on things that have been developed by yourselves. So Jesus, interestingly, isn't in this reading suggesting, and in the words that follow about nothing that goes into a person can make them ritually unclean, isn't throwing away the laws of the Torah. He isn't radically doing that, although we find that the Christian church, and if you think of Peter's experience in Acts, where he does get that vision that actually it really doesn't matter what you eat at all. None of those rules apply. There's a bigger new rule. It is interesting that he's basically saying, well, look, you're teaching these rules and you're making these regulations up, but they really are just your rules. They're just traditions. And that's the point of our story. Not that Jesus comes along to do away with the Old Testament per se. He uses that language of nothing that goes into a person makes them ritually unclean, again as that bigger picture, that story about the fact that the motivation of our hearts is what drives our actions and our words and our priorities, and it's that needs to be clean, it's that needs to be pure. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul and your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. That's the guiding principle above all other things. And what you do in terms of your practices, even your religious practices, is irrelevant compared to that. And the lesson for all of us, of course, as it was for people then, is that nothing should transcend that. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because each one of us is brought up in a particular culture, in a particular context, with our own particular family. And there are all sorts of traditions that we grow up with. Some really nice ones, what we do at Christmas. The fact that in the summer we always do X, Y, or Z, or whenever we see an ice cream van, we buy one. All sorts of practices which define us, which we hold to be important, which are precious to us, which we enjoy and which we love, and can be good and productive. But when it comes to our religious practices and the outworkings of our faith, there really can't be any priority given to, oh, well, we've always done it that way. Or even solid thinking and rational thought has gone into developing this system of belief or practice. I mean, all of those things are helpful, but there needs to be always the greater desire to do what God wants. And what God wants is for us to look at the world without prejudice, with universal love, with grace, with kindness, and with service, because that's how God has dealt with us. Anything else is really just stuff, is really just practice, and is not in any way, shape or form meant to hold any great sway on how we behave. We should never be afraid to do different things. And this is so interesting because even on a morning like this morning, when I'm about to set off and share worship with a particular fellowship, they have a particular time of meeting, a particular place where they gather. We'll use songs from a particular book because that's what they have. People will have an expectation of what we'll do in that service. And none of that ultimately matters. It's a useful framework because if we rolled up at any time and nobody else was there, or we don't set some kind of parameters like, well, let's sit down maybe, then it would be sort of chaos. But then that should be fine too. But the more we formalize things, the more we regulate things, the more we have a particular set of code of practice for things, the greater is the risk. It's not an inevitability, but the greater is the risk that we'll end up creating a set of rules that we end up following and serving, which take priority over the bigger picture. And it is people that matter, not practice. It is loving others that is important, rather than achieving a certain thing. So our call to action, as always in the Gospels, is to look at what Jesus was doing in the healing of the sick, in the miracles, in the revelation that this was God in human form, and then do something with that. Take that out to wherever we are placed, whatever our context, and to love unconditionally as we ourselves have been loved.